Yeah, so today's Eucera, it's one of my favorite groups in a way because initially it gave me an incredible number of headaches, and then over time we kind of were able to figure out, Mike Garduzer and other people, some of the issues with the current guide, which was basically Mitchell, and some problems. So I think we have the far eastern ones resolved. There's some Midwestern ones. I invited Mike at the very last moment to come in and maybe talk about some of the Midwestern species which are now in the guide. So let me flip to the screen at this point. And but I will mention, let me just get there first, that Eucera and the members of Eucera have been involved in like 1 million taxonomic pots in the past. Sinaloa, Tetralonia, Eucera, and then switch back and forth, some members going one way, another, and coming back. Right now, as we always do, we go with John Asher's list of taxonomic names. So currently, we are keeping what has been the traditional Eucera designation for the past 20 or so years at least. And that means that we have not brought Peponapus and Cemalobus into that clan, but we could. If John's next iteration shows that is what is going on, we'll do that. So right now, we won't be talking about Peponapus here. We can, if we have time at the end, we can look at Peponapus and look at the differences. But that's not on the agenda right now. So if people are wondering about that, and if, as usual, if people in the chat want to find the lovely paper that talked about why Eucera needs to be revised at the genus level, that would be great. I believe it was an Israeli. I gave him a bunch of specimens, but at the moment I can't think of his name. So we are, theoretically, we're seeing my screen, and we're going to go to the Eucera guide, and we're going to go to menu and has, and like last time, we're going to go through the characters and look at those, and then we'll talk about in detail some of the species pairs, which comes up when we talk about the characters. So first, though, let's go to the microscope, and we'll take a look at this specimen. This is Eucera hamata, and indeed, it looks very much like, this is a female, it looks very much like Peponapus, and I'll show you the trick to telling it apart from Peponapus. There's several other features, but the vibe is like, oh, that's a Peponapus, or that's Peponapus pruminosa, the eastern Peponapus. There's a bunch of western ones, but it's not. It's Eucera hamata. So just some characters here to talk about why this is a Eucera, not a Melisodes. We've covered this before. Just a little review. So if we look at the tegula does not have the outline of the tegula at the upper part, often covered with hairs, and deceivingly so many times in Melisodes and Eucera, would be the outline of the whole tegula would be round. So this is let me just go in even further. A good example of hiding. So in order to determine whether this is round or not round, and what we're looking at here with the pointer is, here's the tegula right through here, but you can't see what's going on in the upper part. So I'm not going to bother scraping it off, but in Eucera, it's just an oval like most bees have. In Melisodes, the outline and the upper part after the greatest width here becomes either flat to a small rounded area, or actually will be slightly concave to a small rounded area. So that's a separation for Melisodes, but again, you would take the tip of a pin, scrape that off, and look at it, because you cannot determine it from here. And that's what I think people say, oh, well, that looks, you know, like it does or doesn't have it, but you really don't know with that hair up there. You would have to scrape it off. Another big hint, though, that you're dealing with Eucera, I should say the biggest hint is that these are spring bees, and Melisodes are not spring bees, but summer to fall. There's a window, though, there in early summer where you can have both. But a hint should be like if you get something that looks like this in April, May, then you're almost certainly dealing in the mid-Atlantic, and then you would have to rectify that to the south or to the north. But you're almost certainly dealing with a Eucera, not a Melisodes. And then if you're dealing with September, October, you're almost never dealing with Eucera. June and some of these other in-between ones possibly could have both. Okay, but another vibe is this hugely projecting Clypeus mound. You can see a lot of species have something, Andrina, for example, nearly flat, and Melisodes, it's somewhat mounded, but nowhere near this greatness. So that's a review. Now we're going to the trick for Hamada. It keys out with other features too, I believe, but the key is to, and what we use, because this is the most common species, is to look at the hind tibial spur, and also the middle tibia spur also works the same way, because, first of all, I thought I had a specimen here that had it very prominently so we could find it in the open. Let's see this view. Oh, there we go. I'm going to turn it a little bit this way. So the inner hind tibial spur has a 90-degree hook on it. Nothing else has that, at least in the east. And this also is visible on the middle leg, but there you see this sharp hook in. And that's an unusual character. Most species of tibial spurs have come to a point that is linear to the rest of the segment. This one does not. There are a few other species to look at in all the genera where often or sometimes you have modified tibial spurs of to different degrees. And I guess I'm not going to try and review that because we have to focus on Eucera. I would say that Pepinapis would have another layer here on the basotarsus of short hairs. It would be orange and would not be quite this dense, but there's a short brush within there to separate it out. You don't see the other characters. Okay, back we go. So I'm going to stop because this is such a good character and we have lots of other things to go through with the more tricky species. And oh, you know what? Sorry. I actually ran into, if you recall, last time we were working on Savastra, and I said I don't have any comped up. Well, I found some specimens in another set of drawers. So I just want to very quickly point out the male and female characters. So these are big, right? That's the specimen there. It even at low power does not more than fills the screen. In the female, this is an Eucera specialist. So in the female, it's easy to separate out from the other Savastra because it has simple hairs on the tibia and the basotarsus. So the others have very plumose divided hairs. And here you can see they're very simple, and that's clearly there to handle the weird, sticky, byssal-threaded pollen grains that Eucera has. Other species from very different even families have the same sort of pattern. Simplified hairs, no branches. So that's the character there for the female. And then the male, which is also quite large, as are most of the Eucera, the Savastra, has a very different pattern to the first antennal segment, where instead of being very, very short, let me get this angled right. Instead of it being very, very short, it's actually very nearly the same. So there's here's the scape, pedicel, F1, F2. F1 is almost the size of F2, very different from the others. So that's a very clear, and because of these differences, this is often thrown into, I think, Anthomergus as a separate genus, but currently it's Vastra. So very clear, nice characters to differentiate Compta. All right, back to Eucera. Sorry for that interruption. Let's go to
Sam. Which Savastra was that?
Compta, C-O-M-P-T-A.
Thank you.
All right, so Hamada is the most common eastern, at least mid-Atlantic, northeast species. Now we're going to go to rosae, and we're going to go back to the has button. What filthy fingers I have. And this is a darker bee. Most of the hairs on the abdomen are dark colored, as are the scopal hairs we see in that view. Atriventris also has pretty much the same aspect, and we're going to talk about separating those two. If we go here, so we talked about the tibial spur, and now we can go right to atriventris versus rosae. So these have traditionally, these have been tricky to tell apart, but there's actually a whole clade of differences that in aggregate will make it clear whether you have atriventris or rosae. So both of these species, at least the eastern ones, have little to no white hairs other than T1 on the abdomen and have dark scopal hairs. So, and if we look at the differences between the two, this is where we're going to go back and forth. We're looking at rosae now, which in general is the more common one that I've seen. And atriventris is around, and initially I thought it was the more common one, but it actually is not. So when we look at rosae, we look at T2. We're going to compare T2 between the two. The depressed rim with pitch largely restricted to the base of the depressed area and the center of the segment. And this will contrast with what we see in atriventris. So if we look here, and the amount on the rims of the abdomen are useful in several degrees. So what we're looking at here is T1, T2, and T2 has, when we talk about a depressed or impressed, or I think there's a couple other words for this, but here's the entire rim. This is the section that's going underneath the T1. There's hairs, as in many species, just coming out from underneath it. There's a densely pitted area, and then there's a portion of the rim, and almost all bee species have this, but it may be wide and may be narrow, and sometimes that's a good character, Andrina, for example, where there's some demarcation, often associated with a change in sculpturing, but a demarcation where the, let's call it that going from the base to the rim, there's a little downhill. So depressed, impressed, however you want to call it, there's a clear change to a lower state, slightly lower plane, very subtle often, but usually you catch on. It's just the lingo sometimes is off-putting. Let's see if I can get up to a little bit higher. Usually runs all the way across. Hard to see that what's depressed or not in there at this angle with a dark specimen, and not a lot of clarity in terms of the photo, but somewhere in here, it's changing from the upper part to the depressed lower part. And what we're looking at is the amount of pitting in that central area So things often change as you go to the side. So for example, you can see in the central area, there's relatively few pits, but as you go more and more to the side, you build up more pits. But we're talking only about the central area, and we're saying, oh, you know what? In rosae, there's relatively few pits, and now we're going to swap this out. Look at the same section in atriventris, and hopefully we will notice, I believe, a greater density of pits in that T2 central area. So this is an older specimen and dirty. It's not even mine. So here we are, T1, T2. The depressed area is somewhere in here, and you can see that, despite this central shiny area, that the pitting here has invaded that area a whole lot more. In fact, it goes almost all the way to the rim, and there's a pretty uniform, dense coating of pits across the whole thing. So relatively quite different. So now we're going to spin and look at the head at a couple characters here too. And we're going to go back to the thing here and see what else it says. So if we're looking at atriventris, we're talking about wide depressed rim of T2 with pits present throughout, usually with a slightly lower density in the center and only a narrow unpitted section. So we saw that. Now, when we look at the distance between the eye, so this is the compound eye, and the intersection of the edge of the mandible and the clypeus, that's wider than the widest part of the scape. So the scape is being used at in this section. Elsewhere we use the ocelli, but here we're using the scape. How does it compare to the scape? And what we're seeing is that the that width is relatively wide compared to rosae, and that it's about the width of the scape. So let's take a look and see if we can find that. So what we're looking for is we're looking in this area. So here's the clypeus. Here's the rim of the clypeus. Here's the suture between the clypeus.
Sam?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, before we go too deep into this clypeus conversation, we have a question that just popped up in the chat.
Sure.
When you say depressed area, do you mean it's dorso-ventrally depressed? Depressed like a swale? Question?
Yeah, so often if it's like depressed like a swale, the technical term would be more towards a sulcus. It's a little bit difficult to describe. So what I'm talking about when I talk about the depressed or impressed rim is that the entire length of the rim is slightly, again, it's very slightly lower than, but forms a new plane. So it's as if you've gone down a step, but a very shallow step. And that step in some species is wide, in some species is narrow, but almost all of them have that. There are terms also like gradulus, I believe, is often referred to the upper part, and then the depressed rim is maybe called something else. I don't know. But does that make sense? It's a little bit of a subtle, took me a while to catch on to what the heck they were talking about when I was first learning there. I hope that helped. So I'm going to try and get to...
It helps.
Okay, good. Get to this shot, and what we're looking for, a little bit tricky to see, I'm going to move it further down, is here's the eye, obviously, and here is the clypeus, and the suture of the clypeus is running up like this. So it's this gap here between the eye and the clypeus is relatively wide. So this should be about the width. Maybe it doesn't show up exactly well here because of ocular distortions, but it's should be about as wide or a little bit wider. This should be wider than the greatest width of the scape there as a measuring tool. As you can see that. So I'm going to change the lighting a little bit so you can see it maybe a little bit better in that shot there. It's this area. This is actually part of the face or parocular area. And this over here is the clypeus. This is obviously the eye. So this gap, pretty big. Now, we're going to swap back to rosae, and it should be a lot narrower. And this also goes for dubitata, which has a dark form that I don't have a specimen of, but have seen in Georgia. It seems like a southern coastal plain thing. Has a dark form that, let's see if we can get the scape in there at the same time. That vibes similar to rosae and atriventris. Okay, so what we're looking at here, clypeus edge, eye edge, here's that distance. It still exists, but this is the scape again, you know, because of, what is it, polarity? I'm not sure. But this does appear, even in this, the way this shot is, that this is actually wider. The width here of the upper part of the scape as a measuring tool is wider than that. So this is relatively narrow, is the point. All right, and then we're going to get to some labral. So we're going to retain our friend rosae here, and we're going to try and get a shot of her labrum. So yeah, this will do. All right, clypeus, labrum nicely flayed out, and this is the galea of the tongue out here too, and then some weird hair fringe that no one seems to use as an ID character. Perhaps they've overlooked it. All right, labrum here. You can see the pitting, and we'll play with the lighting here a little bit so you can see that better. But what you can see is that there's pits all throughout the center, pits along the rim, and then there's two spots you can't quite see on the other side, but there's two spots here that have no pits. And if one had a better sense of the topography than this is portraying, you'd see that this is slightly raised too. So no pits in those areas. And so if we swap back, what we should see in our atriventris specimen is that it is essentially a labrum that is completely filled with pits and has no raised. It's possible that the area is raised, but it just does not have. It may be actually filled with too much hair to see very well. But let's see what we can do. Change the angle. Should make a center of this disc down here with a target. All right, so here, well, maybe it doesn't show up as much as I would like. You can see that at least the pitting area is much wider. I thought it was completely full and didn't have any shining area, but it does look like this is shiny over here on the sides a little bit. I'll go back and look what it says, but that is another character. Let's see. Far sides, so we're in atriventris land. Far sides of labrum with an unpitted, slightly raised area. The unpitted area easily 5 pits or more in diameter. Rosae, far side of the labrum with, oh wait, what am I looking at? Yeah, I'm looking at the atriventris, which is supposed to not have any pits in it, and the rosae is supposed to have pits. Did I do that wrong? Hang on one second. Take that back. And the rosae, I think I was showing you the rosae specimen. And we'll go back to that. So the rosae specimen, far side of the labrum with no slightly raised area, pits extending uniformly across the entire labrum. some vaguely pitted areas on the far side, but with pitting diameters no greater than 2 to 3. Okay, back here.
Sam, what you got on deck right now?
It should be rosae, unless I've mixed the specimens up, but let's take a quick look here. I'm going to angle from the side where we can see the Clypeus. I don't know, maybe I had shown the atriventris twice there. So here's the labrum, and you can see that this might be a little shinier, but the pits are running all the way across here. And so more tightly packed with pits is the answer. For some reason, I thought this was the specimen I was using, and it didn't show. It is slightly raised there. Okay. All right. So there's several ways to look at that.
Can we go back to the Hamada again, just now that we're fixing them into our brain with the correct characters?
Hamada or atriventris?
Oh, yeah, sorry, atriventris.
Okay. So we'll try and look at it from the side to here. Let me get, I think I have to the front. Oh, I have to turn it upside down a bit more to get to where the labrum is. Okay. Move it a little bit more. Okay, so here's the labrum. This would be the area in question, which should be less pitted on the far sides. We change some lighting stuff here. It's a bit hard to see because there's a fair amount of hairs in this specimen, but this area here is relatively unpitted with pit spacing of over 5 pit diameters involved. Let's rotate it and see if we can see the other side in here. Oops. Maybe slightly better. So this is the labrum over here. And the hairs are obscuring things, but you can see hardly, I think there's a couple pits, but this area has very few to no pits with greater than 5 pit diameters in total. I'm going to run it one more time here from this direction. Oh, that might show up better. So here is these large unpitted areas, and over here is these relatively large unpitted areas, which maybe show up better laterally. Okay. Not the greatest of views. Putting that back. And we'll get to the males too here, but I'm trying to not run out of time. Did Mike Harduser make it on? Maybe not.
We'll check the list.
Okay, so going through the females, we have some characters that I think by now a lot of you largely understand, you know, whether T5 is largely black to blackish or white to orange, and different species groups split out there, and some are combined. So female T2, length of the unpitted apical rim compared to T1. So we were just looking at that with atriventris. So it's the length of T1 compared to T2. Again, that's something that I think most of you can do on your own, and it helps again, split out some of these groups with plenty of overlap. So there's 4 kinds there. And if we switch it to here, we'll see that some of these have, well, actually, maybe there wasn't any overlap. But at times there would be. Let me point out that I don't have a specimen any longer of fulvahurta. It's a rare southern species. It's almost entirely a quite distinct orange, light-colored haired, cool Eucera that Catherine Pears has caught several, and there's like a little bit of a mystery. It seems to be maybe woodland, possibly associated with woody plants, but certainly worth hunting down. So I'm going to turn these off so I don't get confused later. So abdomen T2 to T4, presence of whitish hair bands. Again, that's a pretty straightforward type of character. Color of hair, here's the nearly completely covered in yellow-orange hair, should drop out fulvahurta. And female integument color. So again, we get to fulvahurta being a weird bee. So the integument, so not the hairs, but the integument also has this orangish hue to it. Wish I had a specimen to show you. Very cool thing. So here we have the hind leg color of scopal carrying hair. So we saw with atriventris that they had dark brown to black ones. And when we look at the other species, it parses out quite nicely in terms of dividing those. This one, which in the males is more difficult to deal with, is dubitata, has a dark species to the south, but still with light-colored scopal hairs. And then they have a dark species that seems to be more prevalent in the Midwest. I mean, a light species, which I have, we'll see, more prevalent in Appalachia and the Midwest. Are they more, or the North Midwest? Are they different or not? Hard to say. Okay, so here we have another character, the propodium posterior face lateral margins. We'll take a look at this. But what this is really doing is giving you the speciosa, which is is a Midwestern prairie to Western, I suppose. We can take a quick look here, right? So this is the cool thing about Discover Life. Oh, how interesting. So if we look at the map, here is the bulk of the range is there. There's a hiatus in the middle. But what the heck, there's a little cluster of them there. So I guess I should be more aware of the species too, which was really has not been on my radar. So let's see if we can get back to the guide here from that. But its superpower character is the carinae. So those are raised lines that reach nearly to the propodial triangle when you're looking at the posterior face of the propodium. I'm really going to have to spend more time looking for that. So let's see if I can find a very bent over specimen that maybe about the hamadas, because they tend to be a little bit lighter. So we can look for that carinae, which will not raise all the way to the top, so that you can get a idea of what we're talking about. All right, hamada, big. So, you know, compared to what we've been looking at, big wide bands of white hairs all over the abdomen and light colored scopal hairs. What a contrast with the others. So now, lots of hair back here, so might be difficult to really spot on this, but I can give you the area that would be investigated. And this is why holding specimens in your hand really works, because you can angle the specimen back and forth to see through those hairs. So, oops, we'll take down the lighting level a bit, or the magnification, and So what you would look for is, so here's the scutum up here, the metanotum, no, the scutellum, metanotum, and then this is the propodium. Here's the edge of the propodium. It goes back and around. And usually when we talk about the posterior face, it would be the face that's facing to the rear of the bee, and then lateral faces off to those edge. Often there is this bend between the posterior and the lateral face. There's often a raised area, carina, that runs up here. Look at, this is so typical, like, oh, it's covered with hairs. So you would have to look maybe up here to see if the carina, if it were present. So theoretically, there is a carina down here, but it doesn't get very far. It's very similar characters in Lazy-glossum. And up here, if it were speciosa, it would run all the way up. And it would be somewhere probably in this neighborhood. And I don't see anything. So I think we can eliminate the notion that it is speciosa from that, particularly because it's Hamada and it's got the lovely hooked tibial spurs character. But now I have to think more about speciosa. It's not in the mid-Atlantic, but it looks like it could be anywhere in that Ohio, Tennessee spot. Why is there none in between? I don't know. So let's go back to the guide here. So we've largely cruised through the female ones. Now let's get into the male. So we're back now into this atriventris rosae clade, but we're also got dubitata as being confusedly similar to it. So let me pull this specimen away. And so we'll go back to atriventris and rosae. So one thing about rosae, almost all the specimens, and theoretically this happens in dubitata, but I don't see it, like none of my specimens have this, is there's a very small, but so far I think always present, yellow dot in the upper edge of the mandible, in a place that you know, is just you know, just always about the same, different from lots of other kinds of species where there is yellow present, and usually this whole area is filled with yellow, but it's almost always this. It's a yellow dot. Here's eye, Clypeus, and this yellow dot is on the upper side of the mandible. That is a way big clue that you are looking at rosae. Additionally, we have, as we saw.
Switch it back. I didn't grab a screenshot that wasn't motion sensed.
Yeah, got it. Let's go. Oops. Come back here. And again, this is in the mid-Atlantic. Other than Hamada, this is the next most common species. Spring, I see them in, you know, clovery yard types of circumstances too sometimes. Okay, good, Claire?
Yes, but I want to read a question in the chat out loud. Which is the yellow dot, rosae or dubitata, which I think you just said with your words.
Yes. Well, I mentioned the dot in dubitata because theoretically it's supposed to have one, although I've never seen one. So I'm not sure if there weren't some past confusion. I've not seen one in any of the other species. But I do, it was mentioned in one of the guides somewhere. Now that we're here, we have this similar narrow channel, but the Clypeus is more easily defined here with the yellow. And you can see that that distance is relatively short compared to atriventris, which we'll show in a second. I also want to point out that the yellow on the Clypeus is in the upper part, pretty much goes all the way to the suture line up here. And again, we mentioned in the guide, these are the kinds of things you have to kind of put together as a package, because sometimes, like here, it looks like maybe there is a bit of black at the very edge. Like, I think that's the suture there. Is that black or is that yellow all the way? I'm not 100% sure. And then in atriventris, which is, will have the border incomplete, it can be wider or it can be narrower in that circumstance. And then when we look at the labrum is solid yellow and rosae. Find it again. I guess we're just down further.
Sam, last clarification on that dubitata rosae.
Yeah.
So in the guide for dubitata, it says mandible completely black. But did you not say something about a yellow dot for that as well?
Well, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe there's another section where I thought that dubitata also was noted to have at times a yellow dot. I mean, my experience is rosae, yellow dot, dubitata, no dot. So
yeah, it looks like in the guide the only mentions of yellow are the
rosae.
The labrum and the clypeus.
Okay. And so you can see here, this, although blown out, is pretty much all yellow. So now let's move to atriventris, which tends to be slightly bigger, but again, not, it's only apparent when you have a large bank of these. Let's go and look at the head where a lot of the action is. And but there's also S6, which I need to remember. So here we start with the rim of the eye and the rim of the clypeus. See if I have that right. Oops. And you should be looking at the mandible, which is just simply black. So if we were comparing this to either so there's the edge of the clypeus and there's the edge of the rim of the eye. This is relatively wider. You can see here that the yellow on the clypeus is retracted in here quite a broad way. And the other one, there might not have been a thin dark line. It might have been just it might have been punked by the shot there. But here, this is very clear. There's the rim. I mean, there's the suture line, and there's a big black edge to this, and it looks like it carries throughout. I'm going to spin it a little bit. And that's a very good sign of atriventris maledom. Let's look at it straight on. But again, it's not huge in a lot of these areas. It's a little bit difficult to tell what's going on up there. Like, I'm not sure where the rim is. Let me just change the perspective a bit. Yeah. So again, it's a little tricky to see, but if you were looking in your hand, you could see that this yellow is pulled back from the suture line. And so there's this dark band at the top. I believe that sometimes the labrum is dark or has a dark rim to it too. Let's take a quick look, see whether that is the case in this specimen. Breaking it. Oops.
According to the guide, there should be most obvious on the sides.
Yeah, so here's the labrum, here's the side over here. You can see again, there's black, some darkness along the sides, which were not there in the rosae thing. So there's a good set of characters additionally, we're going to go to S6. First of all, actually, I'm going to go back to Hamada and show you something. In Eucera, on the, let me find, in males, there is no tooth on T7. So if we look at this, what we're looking for that you would see in Melisodes, you would see a tooth on the outer edge of tergite 6 and tergite 7. In rosae, there is none. I mean, in Eucera as in general, I think always, there is no tooth. Let's see if we can see the tooth. This is a particularly beat up specimen, but it's useful because I think the tooth was more visible because the hairs were not as prominently there. So this is T6. That is a tooth. There, I think, is the other side of the tooth. Let's see if I can make that more obvious. A lot of times you have to run a pin through, and on better specimens that are floofier, that tooth is often pretty hidden. So they're not big teeth, really. So there's a tooth there. There is no tooth on T7, but often there are, I don't see them right now, there appears to be. And that reason for that is there are teeth on S7. Let's see if we can find that here. And in fact, in Eucera, a good place to look for, am I looking at two different things, or is that S6? I can't remember. Is looking at, let me spin the label around, is the architecture of the 6th, I think it is, sternite. So if we look here, I might have to play with the lighting a little bit. What we're looking for are two prominent, in this case, in this species, flanges on the edge of S6. This is not showing up well. Let's change some perspective. That shows up a little bit better. So here, and the other one's over there, less easy to see. That right there, it's quite a projecting spine-like point coming out. And so if you were to look at this from the top, you might see that peeking out and go, oh, there's the spine on T7, and make a claim that that was actually a Melisodes, when actually this is a spine for sure, but it is a spine that is emerging from, I think, again, I'm a little confused. Is that S6 or S7? But it's that thing that's there. It should be S7 because I think all the sternites and the tergites are paired. But I think you can see this thing right here, and we'll now go back to Eucera, atriventris, and dubitata, and we'll see that their undersides of T6 are really different from Hamada and useful. So now we're going to rosae and get the and rosae does not have those projecting spines. It's got some ridges though that are potentially useful. And as a very dark integumented thing, difficult to see. So what we're looking at here is, let's call it S7. And so here's the outer rim of S7. You see no projecting spines out that way, but what we're looking at is a ridge, and we're trying to define it with the light here a little bit, and I'll try some more lighting tricks too. But this ridge is running parallel to the outer rim at the upper part of that angle. And you can see there's two. Now you can see the other one is defined there. So there's this ridge down there, here and here, that is, or carina, that is very prominent and parallels the, oops, just smacked the specimen quite hard. So I don't know, we're going to get a whole lot better. We zoom in a little bit more. And, oh, maybe we are. And move this over. And get the label a little bit out of the way. See if we can see this a little bit better. It's a little hard. It's still hard. So here is the outline. So this is T7 up here. So this should be S7 down here. And this is the outer edge, roughly, of S7. And here's a ridge, and this ridge is not very prominent. Let's see if we can shift that around. That is helpful. This shows up in dubitata, pretty much the same architecture, and it's not going to be there in atriventris. I'm going to flip to atriventris now. See what we can see. Equally dark underneath, so perhaps still tricky to spot. And ooh, we can actually see this one, I think, a little bit better in terms of the lighting. So here's the outline of the S6. It's dirty and confusing to some extent, but what is lacking is that clearly raised line that would be running right through this area when compared to the other groups. I don't know if these are hairs or what's going on there, but it's not part of what we're looking for.
What species was that?
This is atriventris. So let's go back to the guide, which appears to have disappeared. Let's see if I can recover it. There we go. And has. And we'll go down to here. So here we are, atriventris, rosae, dubitata. So so we're just splitting out atriventris from the other two, and we talked about gap between the clypeus, S6 with no raised line on the segment at all, and oh, also shortest side of F1 clearly longer than the width of the base of the segment. Let's take a look at that. So that's the first flagellar segment. And we're going to look at the shortest side of that. This took me a while to kind of figure out all this rosae versus atriventris things. So what we're looking at, scape, pedicel, very short scape, and here's the F1. We want to see if this length of the shortest side is greater than the width. I guess I don't want to spend too much time here because I want to finish up, but because you guys can measure this, but let's see if this view is useful. Yeah, pretty much. So the shortest, so you can see that there's a long side and a short side. So even on the short side, it's it's longer than the width of the base of the segment. Let's see what happens when we look at rosae here. So here you can see long side, short side. Short side looks to me to be about equal from this shot. What does it say over here? And these two are together, and short side of F1 about as long as the width of the base of the segment. Okay, so you can see a lot of these are somewhere between difficult to see or have to be qualified. So this is a good exercise in going through a whole series of characters to back up your ID. Okay, so now if you look at dubitata versus rosae, because this last one was simply splitting the two from atriventris. So here we have, as was pointed out, mandible completely black. Okay, good point. And base of mandible with small, dark, smudged yellow dot. Rim of T6 fringed. We're almost out of time, so I'm not going to show a lot of these things here. And so there's some genitalia differences, F1 differences. So let's skip that. Color of hair patterns will help tell apart the different species. The genital capsule is different. Thank you, Mike Arduzer, for pointing those out. And antenna length of first versus second. These are just measurement kinds of things. Where the recurrent vein, joins. Let's see if I can get a quick vein shot here. Because this can be useful in many different kinds of groups. So good to see that. So we are looking at atriventris again. And we are looking at the first recurrent vein here. Here's the submarginals. And you can see it's very close. So this would be 1, 2, 3, very close to the outer parts, or more like 3/4 of the way there. Let's see what it says. Has about 3/4 of the way across the cell, should be atriventris in there. And it does not have that. About 2/3. Do I have atriventris? Yeah. About 2/3 of the way. All right, we'll have to investigate that because it should be less. So 2/3 of the way across the cell, not 3/4. That looked pretty much 3/4 to me. Anyway, I'm gonna go back in there. Maybe we'll just drop that character. I'm pretty sure that was pulled from Mitchell. We've run into problems with placement on those veins changing a bit between specimens. And so there's this gap between the clipeus and the eye again. Labrum has a notch. So I believe was it Hamada has the notch? Has a notch. Some of the Midwestern species have this. Oh, dubitata has the notch. That specimen, that shows up pretty well even through the hair. So let's see if we can spot that notch. I think that's another thing that Mike came up with. That's a great character. All right, dubitata, right there. You can see the clipeus. Can we see through the hairs on the clipeus? What we're looking for is the labrum should have a clear concavity notch in the bottom of it. But again, something that doesn't get seen an awful lot because of the hairs in there. I could see it. You can vaguely see it. Okay, labrum, the notch is right through here, but let's look at some lighting magic, maybe. I think you can maybe vaguely, it's quite large, maybe vaguely make that out, but I don't think we're going to see it a whole lot better. I mean, yeah, with this scope. All right, let me just quickly look and see if there's anything else that needs to be colored before we go. A lot of this is the repetition of the difficult to separate out groups of atriventris and rosae and dubitata. The others, male spots. Oh, this is maybe where I talk about has a male spot. Oh, yeah, dubitata and rosae, at least on this part, are both seen as possibly having that. Color forms of dubitata. So this goes into some of the details about this dark form in the south and not. And I think that's pretty much it in terms of coverage. And we're a little bit over. But are there any other questions?
Nothing in the chat, just appreciation for going over the sternites spines again.
Okay.
Anybody have questions? They can unmute. I'm not in a rush today, so can keep on for a minute.
And also, if you have anyone who would like to present on species IDs in any part of the country, particularly the West, because again, that's not our skill set, just have them contact us and we'll just set it up. And we don't have to do something except help them out that particular week. And it can be the East too. You may just have a different perspective on something and have different tools. Like we saw Denny's great green bees guide. But there's plenty more to talk about.
Are the T7 spines like on Melisodes found on other genera?
I believe so. I can't recall all the patterns. I think Svastra also has those spines. I could be wrong. It tends not to be, unless I'm really in a jam, like it's a terrible specimen or I just have an abdomen. I don't think I use that character. I know that I don't use it very much, but I believe that yes, the two-tooth T7 teeth are present on other genera besides Melisodes.
Okay, thanks. Nothing else is coming in, so I'm gonna stop the recording. See you later, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Claire.
Yay. Send the bumblebee thing right now. Do it.
Okay, all right, I'm working on it mentally.